In the darkest layers of Earth's oceans, where sunlight dies long before it ever reaches the seafloor, there exists a creature so visually impossible that even modern science hesitated before fully believing what it was seeing, a fish that seems less like a product of evolution and more like a biological mistake left unfinished by nature itself, and yet it is real. And it swims silently through the midnight zone with a transparent head that reveals an organ so strange it defies the expectations of vertebrate anatomy, the Barreleye fish, Macropina microstoma, a creature that forces us to rethink not just what we know about deep-sea life, but what we assume life itself is capable of becoming when pressure, darkness, and survival rewrite the rules of existence, because nothing about the Barreleye fish is normal, not its skull, not its vision, not even the way it perceives the world above it. And the deeper we look into its biology, the more it feels like we are staring at something that should not exist, yet does, thriving in a realm where almost nothing else can. Imagine descending thousands of meters beneath the ocean surface, past the last fading trace of blue light, into a world where the water becomes ink and the pressure grows so intense it can crush unprotected metal, where temperatures hover just above freezing and food is so scarce that every organism must evolve like a precision instrument of survival. And in this alien darkness floats the Barreleye fish, barely the size of a human hand, motionless for long periods as if conserving every drop of energy, its body dark and delicate, but its most astonishing feature hidden beneath a dome of completely transparent fluid-filled tissue that encases its head like a living glass helmet, revealing two bright green, barrel-shaped eyes suspended inside like glowing lenses mounted in a spacecraft, pointing not forward like ordinary fish, not sideways like most prey species, but straight upward through the transparent roof of its own skull, as if it is constantly staring through the ocean's ceiling into a world it cannot physically reach. And this is where the first layer of its strangeness begins, because those tubular eyes are not just passive structures, they are highly specialized optical systems designed for one purpose: detecting the faint silhouettes of prey swimming above it against the dim light filtering down from the surface. A biological adaptation so precise that it turns the Barreleye into a living periscope, scanning the ocean above while its body remains almost completely still, hidden in darkness. For decades, scientists only knew the Barreleye fish from damaged specimens pulled up in deep-sea nets, their fragile transparent heads destroyed by pressure changes, leaving only distorted evidence of something too delicate to survive observation. And it was not until deep-sea imaging technology advanced that researchers finally captured intact individuals alive in their natural habitat, revealing the full horror and beauty of its design, including a detail even more bizarre than the eyes themselves: the ability of those eyes to rotate inside the transparent head, shifting from an upward-facing surveillance mode to a forward-facing orientation when feeding, as if the fish can physically reprogram its vision depending on its immediate needs, a capability that blurs the line between anatomy and behavior in a way rarely seen in vertebrates. In the dim water column of the mesopelagic zone, where faint bioluminescent flashes pulse like distant signals from unknown worlds, the Barreleye fish waits beneath siphonophores, jello-like colonial organisms armed with stinging tentacles that drift like ghostly chandeliers through the darkness, and it is believed that the Barreleye times its movements with extreme precision, positioning itself below these drifting predators while carefully stealing small crustaceans or plankton that become trapped or disoriented in the water above, a feeding strategy that depends entirely on its upward vision and its ability to remain nearly motionless for extended periods, conserving energy in a place where every movement is costly and every mistake can mean starvation. But what truly makes the Barreleye feel almost unreal is the evolutionary compromise it represents, because most fish protect their eyes behind solid bone and opaque tissue, shielding them from damage and environmental stress, yet the Barreleye has sacrificed that protection entirely in favor of transparency, allowing its eyes to sit exposed inside a fluid-filled dome that acts like a biological aquarium built into its own skull, raising questions that still challenge marine biologists today. How did such a fragile system evolve without collapsing under the pressure of deep-sea survival? What intermediate forms could have existed between normalized ancestors and this translucent adaptation, and why does this design appear so rare even among other deep-sea species that face similar environmental pressures? In truth, the Barreleye is not alone in its strangeness, but it is one of the most extreme examples of a broader evolutionary theme in the deep ocean, where isolation, darkness, and scarcity produce creatures that seem to break biological conventions, from transparent-bodied animals to bioluminescent predators that lure prey with living light. Yet even among these anomalies, the Barreleye stands out because its strangeness is not about aggression or defense, but about perception itself, about how a creature sees a world that is permanently out of reach, and that is what makes it so haunting, because it is always looking upward, always aware of something it cannot touch, a silent observer trapped beneath an ocean ceiling that it can never cross. When researchers first filmed a live Barreleye in its natural environment, they observed something even more unsettling than its anatomy, a stillness so profound that it almost appeared artificial, as if the fish was suspended in time rather than water, barely adjusting its fins, barely reacting, until a faint movement above triggered a subtle rotation of its eyes, a precise mechanical shift that transformed its entire perception of the environment in an instant, revealing a level of behavioral specialization that feels closer to engineered optics than organic evolution. And in that moment, the Barreleye fish stopped being just a biological curiosity and became something else entirely, a reminder that life in the deep ocean does not evolve toward familiarity or comfort, but toward efficiency in absolute darkness, where even the smallest advantage in vision can determine survival or extinction. And yet, even after decades of study, much about this creature remains unknown, including how its delicate transparent dome remains intact under crushing pressure, how its internal structures avoid damage without conventional skeletal protection, and how widespread this species truly is in the vast unexplored regions of the ocean, because for all our technology, we have only scratched the surface of the deep sea. And every discovery like the Barreleye fish suggests that we are still far from understanding the full scope of life beneath the waves. A world that remains as alien to us today as it was to the first scientists who glimpsed it through broken nets and fragmented specimens, unaware that they were holding one of the most extraordinary visual systems ever evolved on Earth, a living paradox suspended in darkness, watching the world above through a window made of its own body, waiting silently for the next trace of light to pass overhead. Beneath the crushing silence of the mesopelagic zone, where sound itself feels swallowed by density and distance, the Barreleye fish continues its existence in a world that is not only dark but mathematically hostile to life as we understand it, and what makes its survival even more extraordinary is that its entire biology is built around one fragile idea: precision vision in an environment that actively tries to destroy the very concept of seeing, because at depths of roughly 600 to 800 meters, sunlight is not merely reduced, it is fragmented into faint gradients of blue-green photons that can only be exploited by organisms that have evolved optical systems tuned like instruments, and the Barreleye fish represents one of the most extreme outcomes of that evolutionary tuning, with its tubular eyes packed with rod cells, the photoreceptors specialized for detecting low light, arranged in such density that they function almost like biological telescopes, amplifying every trace of illumination that filters down from above. But what makes this system truly unsettling is not just its sensitivity, but its directionality, because unlike most vertebrate eyes that rely on a fixed forward-facing lens system, the Barreleye's eyes are embedded within that transparent cranial dome and suspended in a fluid that allows them to rotate with a degree of freedom rarely seen in fish anatomy, meaning its perception is not locked into a single frame but instead shifts like a controlled scanning array, continuously adjusting its visual field in response to movement in the water column above, where prey organisms, drifting plankton, and bioluminescent signals create a living map of survival opportunities. And in this world, every upward glance is a calculation, because above the Barreleye floats an ecosystem of drifting hunters and glowing predators, including siphonophores whose tentacles stretch like invisible tripwires through the water, and small crustaceans that occasionally lose their orientation in the faint light gradient, and it is here that the Barreleye executes its most critical behavior, positioning itself directly beneath these structures to intercept whatever biological debris or microscopic life becomes available, a feeding strategy that depends not on pursuit but on patience, not on speed but on awareness. And that awareness is entirely dependent on the strange architecture of its eyes, the transparency of its head, once thought to be an evolutionary vulnerability, is now understood as one of its most important adaptations, because it removes the obstruction of bone and pigment that would normally limit upward vision, allowing light to pass through the cranial dome and be focused directly onto the rotating lenses of its eyes, creating a visual system that is almost alien in its efficiency, as if nature experimented with removing every possible barrier between perception and environment until only pure detection remained. But this raises a deeper biological paradox, because such transparency should theoretically make the Barreleye more vulnerable to damage. Yet in the deep ocean, where predators are relatively sparse and encounters are rare, the cost-benefit balance shifts dramatically, allowing extreme morphological experimentation that would be impossible in shallower ecosystems. And so the Barreleye exists as a product of evolutionary trade-offs that prioritize information gathering over physical defense, a choice that reflects the fundamental rules of deep-sea survival, where knowing where food is located matters more than being able to escape a predator you may never encounter. Scientists studying captured specimens have long been fascinated by the fluid-filled dome, often referred to as a protective shield, though its exact function remains partially debated, because it is not a rigid structure but a flexible, pressure-resistant layer that maintains internal stability even as external forces increase with depth, suggesting a level of biochemical engineering in its tissues that prevents collapse under hydrostatic pressure, and this alone challenges assumptions about how delicate structures can persist in environments that would normally destroy them instantly. Yet perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Barreleye's behavior is not its anatomy but its positioning strategy in the water column, because observations suggest it spends long periods hovering motionless beneath potential prey fields, conserving energy in a state that borders on suspension, where even minor fin adjustments are minimized to avoid detection or unnecessary exertion, and in this stillness, its upward-facing eyes act like continuous monitoring devices, scanning for the faint silhouettes of organisms moving against residual light from the surface, a survival technique that turns the ocean above into a dynamic projection screen where every shadow could represent opportunity. This behavior also hints at a broader ecological truth about the deep ocean. It is not a uniform void but a layered environment filled with vertical gradients of light, pressure, and biological density. And the Barreleye is specifically adapted to exploit one of these narrow bands, positioning itself at a depth where upward visibility is maximized while remaining hidden from organisms above, effectively turning the water column into a three-dimensional hunting interface where position is everything. And yet, despite all this precision, there is still something almost unsettlingly fragile about its existence, because a slight shift in depth, a minor disruption in plankton distribution, or a change in the behavior of siphonophore colonies could drastically alter its chances of feeding success, meaning its survival is tied to an ecosystem so delicate and poorly understood that even small environmental changes could ripple through its entire existence without warning. In this way, the Barreleye fish becomes more than just a biological curiosity. It becomes a symbol of how evolution can produce systems of extraordinary specialization that are simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, optimized for a world that is itself in constant flux, and the more scientists observe it, the more they realize that its design is not about perfection in a universal sense, but perfection within an extremely narrow slice of environmental reality, a fleeting balance between darkness, pressure, and scarcity that exists nowhere else on Earth's surface. And as research continues, one question begins to dominate the scientific imagination. How many other creatures like the Barreleye exist in the unexplored depths? Organisms whose anatomy might appear equally impossible, whose sensory systems might redefine perception itself, and whose survival strategies might challenge everything we assume about life's boundaries. Because if the Barreleye fish teaches us anything, it is that the ocean is not just hiding life from us, it is hiding entire ways of being alive that we have not yet even imagined, suspended in the darkness, waiting for the light of discovery to finally reach them. And if you keep descending beyond the known limits of observation, past where even the Barreleye fish becomes rare, past the zones where most scientific instruments begin to lose resolution and confidence, you enter a part of the ocean that feels less like Earth and more like an unfinished planet, a place where evolution is still actively writing experiments in biology with no audience and no explanation. And in that vast pressure-sculpted darkness, the Barreleye fish begins to take on a different meaning, not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a broader pattern of extreme adaptation that defines life in the deep sea, because here, survival is not about dominance or competition in the traditional sense, but about information, timing, and invisibility, and every organism becomes a specialized response to a single question. How do you exist when light no longer guides you? The Barreleye's upward-facing vision, once thought to be an oddity, now appears as one variation of a deeper evolutionary principle where sensory systems become more important than physical strength, and perception becomes the primary currency of survival, which is why many deep-sea species evolve extraordinary eyes, or lose them entirely, or replace them with entirely different sensing mechanisms like pressure detection, chemical tracking, or bioluminescent communication, creating an ecosystem where reality is not uniform but layered differently for every species that inhabits it. In this context, the Barreleye is not just looking upward at prey, it is participating in a vertical economy of light, where every photon that survives the journey from the surface becomes valuable data, and its tubular eyes function like specialized receivers tuned to interpret that data with maximum efficiency, translating faint silhouettes into actionable survival decisions in milliseconds, a process so refined that it challenges our understanding of neural processing speed in low-energy environments. Yet what remains most haunting about the Barreleye is not its efficiency, but its stillness, because in a world where movement often increases risk, it has evolved a behavioral philosophy of near motionlessness, suspending itself in the water column like a biological instrument rather than an active predator, and this stillness creates an illusion of fragility that contrasts sharply with the precision of its sensory system, as if the fish is both extremely advanced and extremely vulnerable at the same time, locked in a balance that only works under very specific environmental conditions. Researchers who have observed it in deep-sea footage describe moments where the Barreleye appears almost unaware of the camera, drifting in place with its eyes slowly adjusting orientation, reacting only when faint disturbances appear above, reinforcing the idea that its entire world is constructed vertically, with up representing opportunity and down representing safety. A spatial logic completely alien to surface-dwelling organisms that navigate in more complex horizontal environments. And yet, despite decades of study, the Barreleye fish remains one of the least understood deep-sea vertebrates, not because it is rare in concept, but because it exists in a habitat so difficult to access that direct observation is limited to brief, fragmented glimpses, meaning much of what we know comes from inference, modeling, and rare intact encounters that survive the journey to the surface. each one providing more questions than answers, especially regarding how its transparent cranial dome develops during growth, how its eyes achieve such mobility without destabilizing vision, and how its nervous system integrates such a specialized sensory architecture without the structural constraints seen in more conventional fish. And this uncertainty is important because it highlights a broader truth about deep ocean biology. We are not studying a fully mapped ecosystem, but a partially visible one, where every discovery like the Barreleye fish suggests entire branches of evolution that remain undocumented, hidden in depths where human exploration is still statistically negligible compared to the vastness of the environment itself. In a way, the Barreleye becomes a reflection of scientific limitation, reminding us that even in the age of advanced submersibles and high-resolution imaging, Earth still contains regions that behave like unknown worlds, where life evolves according to pressures and constraints we are only beginning to model, and where perception itself becomes a survival strategy more important than physical interaction. And when you step back from its biology and consider it as a symbol, the Barreleye fish begins to feel almost philosophical, because it represents a form of existence defined entirely by observation without participation, a creature that spends its life watching a world it can never join, interpreting signals from above while remaining anchored in darkness, a living paradox of distance and awareness. Perhaps that is why it captures human imagination so strongly, because it mirrors a certain existential tension, the idea of being conscious of something beyond reach, aware of a world that exists just outside your ability to interact with it, and yet still dependent on it for survival. And in the final analysis, the Barreleye fish is not an error of evolution or an anatomical curiosity, but a reminder that life does not evolve toward comfort or familiarity. It evolves toward whatever form allows it to persist, even if that form looks strange, fragile, or incomprehensible. From the surface, and as long as the ocean remains largely unexplored, creatures like the Barreleye will continue to challenge our assumptions, silently suspended in the deep, looking upward through a transparent skull, waiting in the darkness that still holds more mysteries than answers.